biblical archaeology. And, oh, Jessica. By the way, congratulations. Again, yeah. Jessica's here with her new baby. Remind me your baby's name. Alan. Okay, awesome. That's exciting. Very, very exciting. So we wrapped up our class on biblical archaeology, and we're going to be making a shift now, and kind of a blending of things that were suggested. Biblical archaeology, and we're going to be making a shift now. You get to hear me again. Kind of a blending of things that were suggested. What? Yeah. DP. All right. So there were a couple of things suggested, and it seems like what's on the forefront of people's mind is just the amount of uncertainty that we're living with, and how do we as a church really reach people when we're living in a period of such uncertainty and so much unrest. We're seeing political unrest. We're seeing fighting and rioting in the streets. We're in the middle of a pandemic, a global pandemic. Travel is restricted. People are losing their businesses. People are losing their homes. There's just this compound issue that's happening all over the place. And, this certainly is affecting people in nations that are developing nations. I know nations like Haiti, they really depend on tourism. Without tourism, the majority of working people in that country don't have income. And so when all these countries, including the United States, and maybe even especially the United States, cut off travel to Haiti, that cut off all of their revenue. And so a country that's already living in extreme poverty, that they're really, really teetering right now. And, it's just, this is going on all over the place. So, I wanted to make that shift and just kind of walk through the scriptures and maybe look at it with a different lens because, again, one of the things that I think that we've been guilty of, at least at certain points in our life, is we focused on us. We focused on our church, on our congregation, on our people. And we've not really thought globally. We've not really thought with this first century New Testament Christian mind where they reached out and touched everybody. Their concern was certainly for the local churches, but they were always reaching out into the community. They were always traveling. They were always, moving from town to town, church to church, house to house, marketplace to marketplace. They were constantly on the move. And I feel like now, ironically, when travel is so easy for us, we have cars. I mean, all of us have cars. Some people within homes have multiple cars per person. Transportation is not an issue for us. Communication is not an issue for us. I mean, we can communicate instantly to anybody, anywhere in the world, and even video communicate with people. We can communicate virtually. And I feel like we've sheltered Christianity in place more now than ever before. So it's kind of the irony, is that in a time when we have access to spread the gospel farther, faster, easier, cheaper, that we've kind of done the opposite with that, and we've compacted it and kind of hunkered it down within our four walls of our local congregations. And I still remember Dr. Schenck talking about this. Harold Schenck, many years ago, he told me one of the biggest problems that we have in Memphis with all of these churches of Christ that are all over Memphis is that we don't even talk to the Church of Christ across the street from us. There's no networking with the churches. There's no working together among the local churches. And that can be replicated all across the nation. I mean, what's our activity with other local churches? It's very minimal. And it's not just church to church, it's, that extends out into the community. So what do we do about that? And how do we navigate that? And how do we think through that given the current climate? My opinion, I'll just give you the end of the class cliff notes, the conclusion. I think that we are living in the absolute most hopeful time. The fields are ripened for harvest. And it goes back to Jesus' prayer where he prays for workers. And he says the fields are ripened for harvest. There is a harvest out there. And I'm going to go through a couple things, both in class and the sermon, that show that people are living on the cusp of desperation right now. The mental health crisis in this nation is really unprecedented in any recent years, especially among young people. There's a study that we'll look at again during the sermon that talks about the mental health of young people and the high level of depression, chronic depression, suicidal ideologies. This idea that they want to end their lives. It's unprecedented. Those rates are super high. Now we can either look at that and say, man, we're doomed. We may as well just shut down now and give up. Or we can look at the approach through the lens of Jesus Christ, where Jesus ministered to those people, right? That was his entire ministry. He didn't minister to the righteous. And that's my passage in class when Jesus says, it's not the righteous, it's not those who are well who need a doctor, but those who are sick. I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus ministered to people whose lives were full of trauma. And I just had an online meeting, speaking of that convenience. I just had an online meeting with the new executive director of Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. Pete Singer is the new executive director, and I had never met him before, so I work with Grace, so we were introduced virtually. And he said something that really stuck with me, and I want to use that kind of as a springboard into this lesson. But he said, one of the issues about reaching churches and trying to convince them that we have to address trauma. And this was in response to a question that I had for Pete, because I was kind of wrestling with how do we talk to churches when churches are it's kind of like the Titanic. People are playing violins as the ship's sinking. It's that blocking everything out and acting as if everything's normal when the ship is going down. I said, how do we break into the churches and convince them that oppression is an issue, that abuse is an issue within the church, that people are struggling, that contributes to the mental health crisis? And his answer was really powerful and profound. And he said, we have to first realize that the Bible is a collection of trauma stories. From cover to cover. It's a collection of trauma stories where people's lives were full of incredible amounts of trauma. From wars to poverty to people being swallowed up, and on and on and on and on. Sickness, chronic illness, death, like crazy throughout the Bible. If you look at the Bible through that lens, you realize that the Bible is a trauma story. But that's not the end of the story. That's not the conclusion of the story, is that mankind is doomed to live trauma. The conclusion of the story is that there's trauma in a broken world and in a sinful world. And it's just always going to be there. There's always going to be poverty. There's always going to be sickness. There's always going to be evil. There's going to be that in a broken world. And the conclusion of the matter is, but there's hope. But God reaches into your world. And he picks us up and he cares for us and he nurtures us. And He mends us, and He restores us. He redeems us. He cleans us of our sins. And so I think we've really gotten away from that message as the church. And I really try to keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on in the church in the United States. And you want to know the trend that I'm seeing among churches in this year, 2020, in the year of pandemic? You want to know what trends I'm seeing? Anyone want to guess? Closing doors? Yeah, that's one. You want to know what a main contributor is to that? One of the biggest contributors? Were you going to say something, Tex? Yeah, I don't think that's the issue at hand. Yeah. Apathy? That's a big part of it. Yeah, apathy. What's another one? Probably the biggest one that I'm seeing. What's that? Yeah, people giving up. And one of the biggest contributors to that is fighting. This people just going at it. I just read a post this morning from somebody I don't know personally, but somebody in a church had lamented that they were in ministry and they resigned. Lots of people resigning from the church this year. Lots and lots and lots and lots of people just giving up ministry. They're done. They're checking out. They're done. We already have a major shortage of ministers. We've had a major shortage for years. That's going to be compounded big time after 2020 is done, which it's almost done. But this person said, we left the church. This was a church that at the beginning of the year was 250, 300 people. They're down to 50 people. And just the amount of infighting, everybody on the leadership team has resigned, not just the ministers, but elders, deacons, everybody they just pulled out. They're just fighting with each other.
I think something that is very important, and that is church leadership.
Yeah.
Leaders need to go ahead and follow their own advice and stand up for God, for His Word, and show the proper Christian attitude of love, of proper leadership,
and tolerance. That's something that we've become increasingly intolerant of our own, of other Christians, of people who are saved. And those are the people that we attack first. And when people who are not Christians see that, they don't want anything to do with it, and you can't blame them. They pull away, and they're like, why would I want to be a part of this? All you guys do is attack each other and fight. So, I think a couple things. One, that's going on. Two, that's causing a lot of churches to close their doors. Three, that's not necessarily going to doom the church. And four, as the church, we really need to refocus, and we need to retool, and we need to focus on people who are genuinely hurting. You guys, you lost your son a few weeks ago. Can you imagine if the church's response was to ignore you guys because we have other things to fight about? We're fighting about whatever. Can you imagine how that would leave people when churches are fighting, when people are dying, people are hurting, people are struggling? The best thing we can do is just forget about the little petty problems that we have with each other. Because if we're going to go down through the list, buddy, I could come up with a long list for everybody, and I can guarantee people can come up with a very long list of problems they have with me. That's human nature, right? We need to forget those little petty things that don't matter and collectively come together as God's people, full of the Holy Spirit, and give hope to people. The fields are ripe for harvest. There's no reason why churches shouldn't be growing by leaps and bounds right now. There's no reason except us. we're the reason. It's not that the gospel is not relevant in 2020. It's not that we're kind of stuck in old traditions and we're just not going to grow. We're not going to grow. It's not those things. It's that we're not doing the work. So I want to look at an article. If you guys want to put this up, this is just kind of a snapshot about the issue of poverty that's going on in the world. This comes from the United Nations website. The article is just called Ending Poverty, which, by the way, I think is a little bit silly of a title. We're not going to end poverty. Poverty is never going to be wiped out. While global poverty rates have been cut more than half since 2000, 1 in 10 people in developing regions still lives on less than US $1.90 a day. The internationally agreed poverty line and millions, by the way, listen to that statement. The internationally agreed upon poverty line is $1.90 a day. That's how they define poverty. If you're living below $1.90 a day, that's considered poverty. That's the internationally agreed upon poverty threshold, $1.90 a day. Think about that. Think about the things that we complain about. Think about the things that we purchase and then complain that we don't have any money. I'm broke. How many times have we said that? I'm broke. No, we're not really broke. As long as we still have a home and we still are able to put food on a table and and we're taken care of, we're not broke. We're not living on $1.90 a day. We're not living at that poverty level. Millions of others live on slightly more than this daily amount. Significant progress has been made in many countries within Eastern and Southeastern Asia, but up to 42% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa continues to live below the poverty line. What's the poverty line? $1.90. Let me read that again. Up to 42% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa continues to live below $1.90 a day. 42%. What is poverty? Poverty entails more than the lack of income and productive resources to ensure sustainable livelihoods. Its manifestations include hunger and malnutrition, limited access to education, and other basic services. By the way, in developing nations, you pay for your education. It's not like the United States where we have tax revenue and we fund our kids' education. Our kids get a free education. That doesn't happen in developing nations. So if you don't pay for your child's education, which, by the way, it's not cheap, the majority of people cannot afford to put their kids in school in developing nations. Its manifestations include hunger and malnutrition, limited access to education, and other basic services, social discrimination and exclusion, as well as the lack of participation in decision-making. In 2015, more than 736 million people lived below the international poverty line, which is what? $1.90. More than 736 million people living below $1.90 a day. And around 10% of the world population is living in extreme poverty and struggling to fulfill the most basic needs like health, education, and access to water and sanitation, to name a few. There are 122 women aged 25 to 34 living in poverty for every 100 men of the same age group. And more than 160 million children are at risk of continuing to live in extreme poverty by 2030. That's what's going on in the world right now. If we move beyond ourselves, which is hard to do sometimes, right? Especially this year. People are feeling the weight of our lives being disrupted and all that stuff. Schools disrupted, jobs disrupted, livelihoods disrupted. And I'm not minimizing that whatsoever. Not at all. But if we move beyond that, if we move beyond ourselves, we realize that there's this much bigger picture that's going on around the globe where people are living in absolute desperation, absolute poverty, disease, lack of water, lack of sanitation, lack of medical care. They also have to pay for medical care out of pocket. When you're in developing nations, people don't go to the doctor because they can't. Here, even if you don't have insurance, hospitals can't deny you. You can walk into any ER anywhere in the nation, and you're going to get care, whether you can afford it or not, because they can't deny you. It's a basic human right in the United States, where people cannot be denied health care, even if they can't afford it. And that's not the case in other countries. You don't have cash in hand, they'll say, see you later. They will not take you unless you can pay for it up front. And if we really wrap our minds around that, it goes back to what is our purpose here on earth? Where do we direct our funds, our budget, our church budgets? Where's that directed? Is it directed towards this? Or is it directed towards, so many churches are filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy because they have these massive stadiums that they buy so that they can pack more people inside of them and pay their celebrity pastors, $1 million a year or whatever. Outrageous incomes. Outrageous incomes. And to juxtapose that against this, where people are dying every day, millions of people are sick and diseased and poor and don't have access to education. And if you don't have education in another nation, you're going to be living in the streets the rest of your life if you make it that long. So I want to look at a scripture that just kind of summarizes this. It's in Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19. Now I'm just going to read a bunch of this. I might start, I'll just start in verse 1. Leviticus 19. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves any gods of cast metal. I am the Lord your God. When you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, you shall not offer it so that you shall offer it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it, or on the day after, and anything left over until the third day shall be burned up with fire. If it is eaten at all on the third day, it is tainted, it will not be accepted, and everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity, because he has profaned what is holy to the Lord. And that person shall be cut off from his people. By the way, this is just basic sanitary precautions. Anything that's dedicated to God is not going to be full of bacteria and rot and disease that's going to make you sick. God is caring for his people. Verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare. Neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I'm the Lord your God. Do you hear what he's saying? When you farmers go out, every field that you gather your crops from, don't gather clear up to the edges. Leave a portion of that for the traveler, for the sojourner, for the poor people, for people to come into your fields and to what? Yeah, survive. Can you imagine if we did this? Look at the box car loads of food in the United States that we throw away every single day. When the pandemic first hit, one of the things that dairy farmers were doing was what? What were they doing with their milk? Yeah, they were dumping it. They were dumping tractor-trailer loads of milk, literally. They were dumping it in open fields. Farmers who, by the way, are barely making it. They're really struggling because of the price of milk. But because we're in America, and we throw stuff away, and we have a really weird system. You don't find people who need the milk, you just dump it, right? You just dump it over an embankment. So Leviticus, if we followed Scripture, people's needs would be met. They would be taken care of. Well, before I continue, this is something too that I remember my sister Stephanie saying when they first went into Haiti, there was an entire runway in Port-au-Prince that was covered with crates. From when the Clintons came in 2010, the Clinton Foundation, they were going to donate all this stuff, and they were helping Haiti, and they were going to feed people, and there was all this food and tents and blankets and all this stuff. Steph said that when they flew into Port-au-Prince, every single one of those crates, years after it was delivered in 2010, is still sitting there. Food that is just rotten. Sitting in hate. I mean, imagine the slap in the face to a nation where they're living in extreme poverty. And they need the supplies. They need the food. And it's just sitting there on a runway. If we actually lived by this model and realized that the Bible is full of trauma stories, and it's not just stories, that God calls us to respond to the trauma. The church would be in much better shape, but more importantly, people who are desperate would have hope. Verse 11, you shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, you shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Why are these things important? Why is it important not to steal? Not to deal falsely, not to lie. Why is that important? Because it hurts people. Destroys people. It ruins people. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. Imagine that if people got paid every day instead of once every 2 weeks. Right? Like that's the biblical system of payment is don't let the sun go down. When somebody works for you, don't let the sun go down until you've paid them. How many people do you know who live paycheck to paycheck? And that's not, a judgmental statement that, well, they're spending beyond their means. Some people genuinely, a lot of people genuinely are living in poverty here in the United States. How many people do you know who are living paycheck to paycheck? All of us. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people here are living paycheck to paycheck. What if we were paid every day? And that would help us to refocus, right? Because we get this big paycheck at the end of 2 weeks, and it's easy to burn through that because you're like, wow, I just got paid, I just got paid $1,000 or whatever. And
I have to buy this not on time, but
yeah,
like electricity. I can't pay the electricity
right.
at the end of the month, but I've already used it, and I keep
Yeah.
paycheck. So everything kind of revolves around that system of
Yeah,
buy it and wait till you get paid to pay for it.
yeah,
Because if you got paid every day and paid for your electricity every day.
yeah. Then you can monitor your usage better, and yeah, it just it makes sense. You shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you at night until the morning. Verse 14, you shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. Verse 15, you shall not do injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great. But in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So as I read this, I'm thinking back to all the posts that I'm seeing. A lot of those friends of mine who are in ministry, or they're attending churches somewhere, and they're like, man, our churches are just at each other's throats. People are fighting. People are getting kicked out of the church. People are resigning. Leaders are resigning. And it's this vicious cycle. And I look at this and I'm like, they're not obeying the most basic command of God, which is what? The second greatest command. Love your neighbor as yourself. None of us would treat ourselves the way that we treat other people if we're doing that poorly. Right? None of us would do that to ourselves. We don't appreciate it when people do it to us. And so there's this confusing thing going on in the church, and I mean outside of the church certainly, but where people are attacking their own. And it doesn't make sense to the unchurched people. And it certainly doesn't make sense to the people who are living in extreme poverty. All these people that are living at $1.90 a day or less, when they see spoiled people fighting with each other about, you name it, it makes no sense to them. It can't make sense to them. So I really, as this class unfolds, I want to talk about practically what we do in a community that's stricken with poverty. We have poverty in Somerset County, a lot of it. How do we respond to that in a Christ-centered way? What do we do? How do we assign people? One of the books that we all read together, High Expectations. How do we increase the expectation that we move beyond these four walls and reach into the lives of people and help them? And I can tell you, when you do that, people remember that. They really do. And Christ becomes attractive to them because there's what? Hope. There's hope for a better day. There's hope of salvation. There's hope of being rescued. There's hope of being taken care of. There's hope of being treated with courtesy and respect. And that's attractive. And that's exciting. I really think we are living in a very hopeful time for the church. We can't deny that churches are closing their doors like crazy. That may not be a bad thing. Yes?
God mentioned
Yeah.
From personal experience, I can remember I was doing, it wasn't long before my mother had a stroke. Eventually died. I had to be here to go down there and take care of it. I was just so I had to leave work. I was out of work working at 8. Wasn't concerned about that. I wasn't even a month came about. And then all of a sudden, one night thinking about it, I called home and talked to Tess. I said, we need to figure out where we're getting money to pay the bills since I haven't worked.
Yeah.
So if we need to put her on the charge, whatever, and she said, don't worry about it. Today, the particular just stopped by. Knew that you were out of work, not out of work, not working,
Yeah.
and gave her some money. And he didn't know what our bills were,
Yeah.
but it was enough to cover it. I think it was like $400. He covered that. And we talk about bringing that a little closer to God when we see the love of somebody.
Yeah.
Just knew there might be a need and stepped up.
Yeah.
That was, we'll say at least 18 years ago.
Yeah.
So that still does make a difference.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what makes Christ real to people. Not telling people what they need to do and, what they should be doing, and you should be going to church, and why don't you, even the invitations, they're nice, they're good. We should invite people to come worship with us, but that's not going to get people closer to Christ. It's that being the hands and the feet of Jesus, and, just doing it quietly. And just going out and you didn't even know about it. Tess did and you didn't. I mean, that is the definition of quietly. Yeah. Yeah. So, honestly, I think we are really well positioned as a body of believers. If we're willing to do the work, we are really well positioned to lead a lot of people to Christ. We really are. So, yeah, I'm not at all one of these people that's shutting down and saying we're doomed. I think we need reminded, we need picked up every now and then. It's easy to get discouraged. I've been discouraged plenty of times. I'm sure all of you have. But we need those reminders that Christ is still Christ, that God is still God, that as long as we're willing to work, God will bless that. He really will. All right, we better stop there, and we'll pick back up in a few minutes.
Sing, amen.